On the morning of the 27th of January 2023, it started like any other for Nicola Bulley. She left her home in the small village of Inskip like she would every day. Her routine was to take her two daughters to their school in a neighbouring village just a few miles away from Inskip, and then go and walk the dog nearby. She had no idea that she was about to be the centre of a media frenzy. This tiny village, with only a few hundred inhabitants, is named St Michael's on Wyre, located in Lancashire. Generally speaking, there's not an awful lot going on in this village. It's a very quiet and peaceful place. It's one of those small settlements where everyone knows one another, and the community is considered to be very tightly knit. Despite the usual peaceful nature of this place, it was about to become the setting of a highly unusual incident. Nicola herself was 45 years old at this time. She was born in Essex and moved to the Lancashire area sometime in the 1990s. Her family and friends described her as a very friendly, caring person and was the sort of person that was very easy to get along with and make friends with. On the morning in question, her husband Paul described it was totally normal. The girls were having their breakfast and everything was pretty much ready to go. After driving her two daughters to school, she dropped them off, parked the car and then walked towards the fields near River Wyre to take her dog Willow for a walk, unknowingly walking right to the very place that she would come to vanish. While she was spotted by the frequent dog walkers there that she knew, and all knew one another, she would walk to a point where she was completely alone. Around a bench, which sits right here, Nicola was away from all CCTV, and at that exact time that she disappeared, was away from all potential eyes and ears. At precisely 8:59 AM, using her phone, Nicola sent a text to a friend of hers, arranging a time for their kids to meet up and play. 2 minutes later, at 9:01, again using her phone, she joined a Microsoft Teams call for a meeting that was taking place for her work. Nicola had both her camera turned off and her microphone muted, as it appeared that she didn't have to have an active role in the meeting, as there were many people present. As touched on briefly, while walking Willow, she had been seen by multiple people whom she knew, and therefore could definitely be placed at the scene. Nicola was spotted for the very last time at 9:10 that morning, and this was from a distance. Then, something happened and Nicola vanished. A short time later, about 20 minutes or so, an unusual scene would be discovered by a member of the public who was also out on a dog walk. This dog walker found Willow unaccompanied by the bench Nicola had been sitting. Willow's harness was on the ground a short distance away and her phone was seemingly abandoned, still on the bench. This person knew that the scene was out of the ordinary and scanned around, expecting to see the owner of the dog coming back or at least just being somewhere around, but there was no one. This dog walker stayed with Willow for a time, and then other members of the public, again dog walkers in the area, came by and also realised that something out of the ordinary had happened. To make matters stranger, it was realised that Nicola's phone was still connected to the work conference call that she'd earlier been listening into. Again, because of this, they must have felt that this person had just popped away for a moment to sort something out and they would be back. But this never happened. In fact, no one was on their way back. If Nicola had just wandered away for a moment, it seems particularly unusual that the dog wouldn't have followed her. But instead, there Willow was, pacing around by the bench, alone. At this point, nobody realised that the person of interest was Nicola until another person came by and recognised Willow. It's important to highlight, and I suppose might be obvious at this point, but dog walkers frequent this area a lot, so foul play wouldn't necessarily be expected to happen here, as people bump into each other a lot. And it becomes quite personable in a way, as everyone knew each other, or at least vaguely recognised one another. Those present at the bench were discussing what the explanation for this might have been. Still, everyone there just expected Nicola to come back. They felt that there may have been an emergency at home, or perhaps at the school, and Nicola had been in some kind of mad dash to sort out whatever had happened. Though in that instance, it still seems very unlikely that she would have left Willow there alone. Nicola was described as being dedicated to that dog, and Willow was very much a part of the family. Given that this was all they could really think of, one person who was present called the school to see if Nicola had gone back for some reason, and the receptionist gave them the negative. However, this receptionist then rang Paul, he said. The phone rang, and it was the receptionist at school. She said, "Mr. Ansell, it's a bit of a weird one, but we found Willow and Nicola's phone on the bench, and the harness halfway down the embankment on the floor." Paul was obviously panicked and confused. He called law enforcement and then quickly made his way to Willow and those that had gathered around the scene. Paul was probably in a state of shock, as it seems he was just expecting to get there and find her right away, but he did not. He retrieved Willow and headed out into the fields and began to look around for Nicola. It's an incredibly unusual situation because, as said before, no matter where she'd gone, you'd think that Willow would have been in the same area with her. Whether that was in the fields, in the river itself, or just out of the area completely, you'd have thought that Willow would have tagged along and followed, but instead stayed right beside the bench, alone. As said previously, the final time Nicola had been positively identified was 9:10 that morning. 8 minutes later, at 9:18, records showed that she had adjusted the volume of the call, and that was the last known time that she had touched the phone. The meeting she was a part of came to an end at 9:30, but at 9:33 her phone was still connected to the call, which I assume was the precise time that it was found by a member of the public. What this means is that there is roughly a 12-minute window in which we have absolutely no understanding of at all. She turned the volume up and then we're left with a question mark. Whatever occurred almost certainly happened between 9:18 and 9:30. Interestingly, I came across this headline while researching this case. While walking in this very area some time prior, Nicola had described it as giving her a spooky feeling. It's not clear if this was just a passing comment, but I found it quite interesting because I'm a big believer in trusting that gut feeling you get sometimes. It's hard to describe exactly, but it's like a primal response to something that you might not even be fully aware of. I do feel that it's generally just best to trust it and leave, but again in this case, it's not clear if that was just a passing comment Nicola made. I suppose that's probably all it was, given that she went back there. In any case, at 11:27, a police officer came and met Paul, spoke about what exactly had happened, and then went on to launch an absolutely massive search operation. Right from the moment the authorities realised what had happened, a large amount of resources was poured into this. There was an aerial search with drones scattered all around the area, professional divers were placed in the water, sonar equipment was being used, fire and rescue services were called upon quickly to help search, and mountain rescue services also came in to scour the surrounding land. Paul was placed in a very awful and hopeless situation now because I'd imagine all he wanted to do was search for Nicola, but he had to go home just in case she came back, but he also had to prepare for just how he was going to manage this information with his young daughters. Paul waited for hours in the hope that Nicola would return, but as time ticked by, he knew that this was serious, and dread must have seeped into the pit of his stomach. And sadly, once the kids came home from school, they asked where Nicola was, and Paul had no answer to give them. Needless to say, but just disappearing for no reason for lengthy periods of time was completely out of character for Nicola. Paul later said, "People don't just vanish into thin air, something happened that day." Paul did say that he was just expecting her to show up out of nowhere and explain what had happened, but sadly that would never occur. Once Nicola had been missing for 3 days, the story hit the national news in the UK, and good lord did it get massive quick. The public became heavily interested and invested in Nicola's disappearance because as the circumstances were laid out, the public just expressed their sheer incredulity at how unusual the whole thing seemed. To everyone just hearing about it or reading about it, it just seemed to lack coherence. When I say that this story hit the national press in a big way, it did. Practically, the entire country expressed their support and vast swathes of people wanted to come and assist in any way that they could. It was really quite unusual in that regard. I've been covering unusual disappearances like this for a long time at this point, and this case was probably the biggest of its kind in terms of publicity in the UK. I've never seen anything like it before here. Usually, you might hear about a disappearance briefly on the news before it fades away, but the coverage here was enormous. The locals who lived in St Michael's on Wyre felt that she must have been somewhere nearby, so they were all out looking for her. Many people from all around the country were also coming down to assist in the search effort, but there was basically no leads to go on at all. There were three possible scenarios that could have happened to consider here. Firstly, that Nicola had fallen into the water. During the mass coverage of this incident, people seemed to have trouble with this hypothesis as the dog wasn't wet. The thought process seemed to be that either Willow may have fallen in and then Nicola went in afterwards to help, but had an accident. That can't have been the case though, as Willow was completely dry and certainly had not been in the river. The other way to explain it was that for some other reason, Nicola walked towards the water, which might have been why she turned the volume up for her wake call. Perhaps she either saw something or thought she saw something in the water that grabbed her attention, and then she walked towards it and fell in. Again though, Willow hadn't entered the water after her, though I'm not completely sure what the expected behaviour would be from a dog in that scenario. Perhaps if not entering the water, you might think that Willow would have followed her along the bank of the river, though I suppose if she went under then Willow would have lost her fairly quickly. The alternative river hypothesis was that this was a purposeful act. However, that seems very unlikely, as just before this happened she was making plans with her friend about the playdate. One way or another though, the fact that she turned up the volume on the call could suggest that there was either a loud persistent noise present, or she was moving away from her phone and for some reason didn't take it with her. Outside of the river, the other ideas were that she may have just gone off on her own free will. This was quickly thought not to be the case though, as there were CCTVs that essentially cover the exits of this area and she wasn't spotted leaving any of them. So again, there was no real evidence that she'd just gone off voluntarily. And again, the fact that she was just making plans with her friend makes that seem even more unlikely. Now, thirdly, and certainly it is felt at times that this was the more popular hypothesis among those who became invested in this case. That being that there was a third party involvement that caused the disappearance in some manner. The issue with this hypothesis, much like the second, was that she wasn't seen leaving the area with anyone. There was also just no evidence at all to point in that direction aside from the fact that Nicola had just seemed to vanish into thin air. The ground around the bench hadn't been disturbed, and it certainly didn't appear that any kind of struggle had taken place. The entire riverbank was searched, and especially the area right next to the bench, but again, there were no obvious signs that someone had fallen in. There was nothing on the ground that could have caused someone to fall, other than your own 2 feet I suppose, which can and does happen. But the point being was that it was difficult to ascertain just how and why one might have gone in the river from the bench. Not only were there no signs along the riverbank that Nicola had fallen in, there were just no footprints along the length of it either to suggest that someone might have been wandering dangerously close to the river. Divers and people searching the river weren't finding any of her items of clothing within it, and when I said they had no leads to go on at all, that really was the case. For a time, it really did appear that Nicola had simply vanished into thin air, and there's no wonder why people got so close to this case. There's just something about it that eludes sense. Throughout pretty much the entire disappearance, the police maintain that Nicola must have fallen into the river, but despite searching it again and again, they were just uncovering nothing. Because of this, the family reached out to Peter Falding, who was a private diving expert. Peter offered the service of himself and his team to the family completely free of charge. It seems that Peter really felt for the family and wanted to help them understand what had happened and to bring about some closure for them. Peter himself is considered a highly experienced diver and has actually worked on a handful of missing person cases where a disappearance has occurred near a body of water. In those cases, Peter actually managed to achieve results and he found the missing. Here are some quotes from Peter as this particular search for Nicola progressed. "It's a mind-boggling one, this one. We're dealing with the unknown here, so we're looking for something that may or may not be here. The phone was found on the bench. The dog lead was found there, and normally she would have been found by now. It's a difficult one. Police have done a very thorough dive search, and they were here straight away that day when Nicola went in. Normally, you would expect to find Nicola at the bottom. If a witness said to me today that there's a person in the river and they've gone in at the section Nicola did, I'd find them within the hour, no problem at all. I personally don't think she's in the river. That's just my gut instinct at this point. I said that if Nicola's here, I'll find her. If Nicola was in that river, I would have found her." The authorities, on the other hand, did firmly believe that Nicola had fallen into the river. They presented their hypothesis to the public a week into the search.
This means that we've only a 10-minute window in which we cannot account for Nicola's movements. The inquiry team has undertaken a number, as I said, of dashcam, CCTV and ring doorbell footages. This has allowed us to eliminate any trace so far of Nicola having left the riverside, which is really important. Our main working hypothesis, therefore, is that Nicola has sadly fallen into the river, that there is no third party or criminal involvement, and that this is not suspicious.
When asked why they were so sure that Nicola didn't leave the riverside, they said, "Several of the exits from the riverside area are either locked or they're covered by CCTV. So, we've been able to look at that CCTV, negate Nicola leaving the local area. The areas that are not covered by CCTV is where we've been particularly interested in dashcam footage." These statements made by the police were met with a lot of scepticism. It seems that many people believed that she couldn't possibly be in that area anymore, and the authorities were saying that she couldn't have left it. Journalists present asked whether Nicola might have had any personal issues that contributed to her disappearance, and the police essentially just said no, and that held no relevancy in this case. So, in that regard, they were somewhat also ruling out this being a purposeful act, or at least dissuading that idea. It's also important to note that the river is usually very calm, and this was also the case the morning that Nicola vanished. Peter Faulding, who as said held prior success in finding missing people in bodies of water, scoured the River Wyre with sonar equipment and other means, but he just couldn't find a trace of her, and therefore started to believe that she just wasn't in the river at all. Even to Peter, the nature and circumstances of the disappearance at the time just weren't adding up. Now, as you might imagine, because of said circumstances, basically everyone was suspect to some degree. And generally speaking, this was for good reason. In many cases of foul play, especially in regards to causing someone to disappear, it's common knowledge that the person responsible is often known to the victim themselves. So, naturally, Paul was questioned extensively by the police. They took some items of his, such as his phone and computer, but they showed no signs that he had done anything wrong. They questioned where he was and what he was doing at the time of Nicola's disappearance, etc. But Paul is an engineer that works from home, and that's what he told them he was doing at the time. And CCTV footage from the home showed him leaving when he was notified about what happened by the school receptionist. So while questioned, the evidence exonerated him, and I don't believe he was ever actively a suspect outside of that initial interest. While Paul may have been exonerated in the eyes of the police, it certainly did not completely rule out the possibility that Nicola could still have been taken by a third party. As mentioned, this hypothesis was already popular and speculations were running wild. Not just among the locals in the village, but around the country too. Nothing was turning up in the river, and because of this, word of this disappearance spread outwards from this tiny village to making headlines in the New York Times. Simply because it was making no sense whatsoever. So, to my American viewers, I'd be very interested in hearing if you've heard about Nicola's disappearance before now, and where you found out about it. Here in the UK, there was an intense pressure put on the police to solve this, and the amount of attention placed upon them and the disappearance was really something else. It didn't help that the police had made numerous mistakes with their handling of this incident. For instance, and this is an obvious one, there was never at any point an attempt to preserve the scene of disappearance. Absolutely anyone and everyone could go right up to the bench and sit down, and they did. Between this lack of preservation and people speculating that foul play was involved, a flood of people were turning up to the village. Live streamers and TikTokers were trespassing all over the place. Random people were just turning up and banging on people's doors, questioning the locals. People were breaking into buildings after dark, and it just became a massive mess. I suppose, in theory, the reason for not preserving the scene was that there was just no evidence of criminality at all. It seems that the primary suspicion had always been that Nicola had just fallen into the river, and therefore, I assume, to the police, there was no reason to block entry to this location. Though that reasoning still seems wild to me. Given that it was an ongoing investigation, it does seem like a huge oversight not to have even attempted to preserve the scene. It's hard to know what the exact thought process there was, Or perhaps there was no thought process, which is equally as terrifying. Because think of it this way, while they may not have been suspecting a crime at that stage, if they later did suspect that for some reason, well now the whole area has been tampered with and evidence has just been lost. Forever. That's gone. There's now going to be footprints all over the place, perhaps DNA evidence left behind on the bench or surrounding ground if any hairs have been shed by anyone. The scene was completely compromised, and it beggars belief to some degree about what they were thinking there. The official police defence on that front was that they said that by the time they got there, enough people had been all over the scene and that there was just no point in preserving it. That wasn't the only mistake the police made. Many people just turning up to the village was also a lack of police presence in the press. By this time, they were much quieter than they had been before, and Peter became something of an unofficial spokesman for the whole incident. And of course, once he'd said that he didn't believe that Nicola was in the water, there was again a lot of speculating going on. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, I suppose, but it seems to me that Peter should never have been in the position of the unofficial spokesman, and the police should have been handling that, especially once it started to get out of control. There were people turning up just to get a selfie of themselves on the bench during an active search. Alongside that, you had people turning up with no evidence whatsoever and trying to blame Paul, saying that they felt that because the situation made no sense, that he must have had something to do with it. Despite the fact that all of the evidence was pointing in the opposite direction, that he was innocent. The police then made another massive mistake. They decided it would be a good idea to hold another press conference, and this time give a conflicting statement than what they had said before. You might remember that the spokeswoman previously had said that Nicola didn't have any personal health issues that were relevant to the case. But now they had said that she was a high-risk individual with specific vulnerabilities that could have been in part responsible for her disappearance. When asked to clarify what those vulnerabilities were, authorities stated that they were just not going to get into them. This made things even worse, because the police went in there with the intention of stopping speculations and rumours, and somehow made the whole thing even worse. Now, there were people wondering about her personal life and if something was wrong, did Paul do something, etc. So now, there were even more rumours about Paul, who we know was inside his house at the time that she vanished. Speculation, in my opinion, is completely fine, until you reach the point of speculating in order to destroy a person's life or reputation without any evidence whatsoever. Now, because the police were an absolute train wreck here, they decided that they would issue another statement to try to clear everything up. They now said that Nicola had significant issues with drink and menopause. Honestly, the way the police handled this entire incident publicly was a total disaster just on every front. That information is so personal, it just shouldn't have been spread like that. They should have just shared that information privately to the various search teams. I've been covering disappearances for quite some time now, and I've never once heard of a woman's menopausal state being brought up in the discussion or investigation. They could have just kept that vague and said that she had personal, private medical issues that she was dealing with at the time. Presumably, I suppose that kind of information could in theory influence the search, but the way they went about that was just terrible. They were essentially forced to share that private information to solve a problem of their own making. Anyway, around 2 weeks into the search, it had gone all the way to the River Wyre estuary in Morecambe Bay and towards the sea. It seems that law enforcement must have felt that she couldn't have been in the river at the location she disappeared from, because despite using expensive equipment, sonar scans, using expert divers, they just weren't finding her there. Okay, now, let's get bizarre. 23 days after Nicola vanished in the first place, 2 members of the public spotted her body in the River Wyre around a mile or so from the point of the bench. So, it appears that the police assessment had been technically correct the whole time. However, as you might imagine, this caused a lot of questions to spring up. The first and most obvious being, why did it take so long to find her? Professional police divers had been in the water the entire time and failed to locate even a trace of her. Peter Faulding and his team faced a similar situation. It didn't seem to matter how many times they searched, what equipment they used, everything was coming back negative. You'd have thought that the sonar scans would have spotted Nicola's body, but they did not. Even in the end, it wasn't the official search that even found the body. It was just 2 members of the public on a walk, I assume. Much of the public was sceptical about this, and many believed that she may have been placed there after the fact, and you can see why people may have felt that way. The second question might be, even if she had been in the water for the entire duration of the search, how did she come to enter it in the first place? While the circumstances surrounding exactly how and why she entered the water is never going to be known, we do know almost certainly that Nicola entered the water there and then. Nicola was wearing a Fitbit watch that morning while on the dog walk, and the data recorded was consistent with a person entering the water. If you remember, 9:18 AM was the last time she interacted with her phone. 9:33 was when the phone was found. At 9:22, the Fitbit showed that Nicola's heart rate had a huge spike, which is common and to be expected when falling into cold water. According to the National Weather Service, cold water immersion can trigger involuntary gasping, rapid breathing or hyperventilating due to the shock of sudden immersion. This uncontrolled rapid breathing can quickly create a drowning emergency if you inhale water and cannot stay afloat. Cold water can cause a sudden spike in heart rate and blood pressure. Again, while we have absolutely no idea how or why Nicola entered the water in the first place, the running hypothesis was that the water was so cold that it was incredibly shocking to her body. It may have shocked her so badly that it prevented her from swimming and getting out, thereby concluding that it was an accident. There were no substances in her system, and as said before, it seems that it would have been very unlikely for this to have been a purposeful act, as she was talking and planning with her friend about some kind of future get-together just moments before. The lead senior investigator stated that there was no third party or foul play suspected in this case. Again though, to reiterate, a strong point of contention throughout this whole ordeal had been that there was not a good understanding as to why or how she came to be in the water in the first place. When looking at the area in question, there was nothing obvious that one might have tripped or slipped on. James Adelaide, a senior coroner for Lancashire, concluded that her passing was accidental and took place after she fell in a cold river. The inquest in Preston had pathological evidence that Bulley passed away as a result of drowning. There was no evidence of substances in her body or the involvement of any third party in causing her harm. I did find this part interesting. The inquest heard from two villagers who heard a short inhaling scream on the morning that Nicola passed away. Adelaide said he had no doubt the scream was heard, but he said it was some distance away from where Bulley entered the river and she would probably already have passed away. It was not relevant to Nicola's passing, he said. That is quite the odd coincidence, I suppose. As far as I can tell based off the reports, the river was completely calm and wouldn't have dragged her away quickly. Perhaps because of the media frenzy and everything that happened here, due to the stress they could have just remembered incorrectly. Or it could be that they actually did hear something and then attributed that incorrectly to Nicola. I'm not sure. Unsure what to do with that really. It's just an odd coincidence that the two villagers heard someone screaming at the time and place that Nicola came to vanish. Just as another aside, and this doesn't really have much to do with Nicola herself, but just to present all of the information, one of the investigating officers in this case, Peter Lawson, also passed away at the age of 50 due to natural causes a little while after Nicola's disappearance had been concluded. I'm sure that you can imagine that this caused speculations to run wild again. I've had to come back to edit this in, but I did find this quote by Sky News. The report praised the police force for its conduct and resourcing of the investigation and search, noting that one advisor predicted Miss Bulley's body would rise to the surface around 3 weeks after she vanished and be easier to locate, which is what happened. So, interestingly enough, an advisor to the police even correctly predicted when her body would be found in the river, had she fallen in the river at the time she did. I'm also just awkwardly editing this in here after the fact too. I came across what I first thought was quite a compelling case for how Nicola may have entered the water in the first place. Police are considering whether Miss Bulley fell into the river while trying to retrieve a tennis ball for her dog. However, no such ball has been recovered. In an interview with Sky News, Miss Bulley's close friend, Emma White, disputed the idea that a ball had been taken on the walk. She describes how Miss Bulley's spaniel would often pester for it, so Miss Bulley had made the decision to stop using it. Willow used to love a tennis ball, but it would disturb the walk, so they haven't had the tennis ball since way into last year, Miss White confirmed. There was definitely no ball. So, That hypothesis was also heavily disputed, it seems, meaning we're back to square one with no real understanding as to how she entered the water. Now, while that brings us to an end of Nicola Bulley's disappearance, in terms of the circumstances and such, one journalist stated that the UK police have never had to deal with a disappearance this unusual before, but I disagree with that statement. Nicola's case may have grabbed media attention like none of the others did, but the weird elements of this disappearance reminded me of some of the others that I've covered in the past, that I'll leave a link to in the description below and at the end of the video on screen. I'll only very briefly summarise these cases here, as I've spoken about them a few times across the channel. Firstly, there's Gaia Pope. This was the case of a 19-year-old woman that vanished in 2017 in Swanage, Dorset. On the day of her disappearance, she began to display unusual behaviour, left her friend's house and then simply just vanished. CCTV footage ended up showing her general direction of travel, and the search led onto a cliff area. The area in question mostly consisted of fields bordering the coast. This area was extensively searched and they found nothing. Then, 9 days later, Gaia's clothes were found in an area already searched many times. Then 2 days after that, her body was found, and I quote, a stone's throw away from the clothing. Again, in an area already searched. Especially since the clothing was found, there was a constant presence of searchers. The coroner wasn't completely sure as to what happened and concluded that it must have been a result of hypothermia in the end, though the circumstances have never been fully explained. There was also Sean Ritchie, who disappeared in 2014, which remains completely unsolved. On a Halloween night, Sean was out having fun with his friends. They started in Fraserburgh and ended up on a farm in Stricken. Things took a turn when a prank went wrong and it led to groups running away from the farm, and Sean found himself alone running away. He was never seen again after this, but some of his items were found. This included his lighter, belt, shoes and hoodie, all discovered in various locations suggesting a certain direction of travel, but only leading to more questions than answers. The terrain was considered harsh and boggy and would have been very difficult to navigate or get away from without shoes, yet he was never found. Thirdly, there was David Plunkett, who went missing in 2004. David was on a night out with a friend of his and he visited the Daytona racetrack in Trafford Park, Manchester. He and his friend became separated during the event. David got himself ejected from the site and afterwards he vanished. His last known interaction was a phone call to his parents at 1:15 in the morning, during which he was incoherent and then began screaming in terror. The phone then fell silent, though remained connected for hours afterwards. His parents were on the other end of that call and described his scream as an unearthly howl, and noted the absence of any background noise throughout the call, essentially saying that it didn't sound like anyone else was present. Despite a major search, David's body wasn't found until weeks later in an area that had been already searched. The autopsy suggested drowning, though similar to Nicola in some sense, it was not clear at all how he actually entered the water in the first place. His phone remained connected to the call with his parents and was later found by his uncle, suggesting it did not enter the water with him. The parents also didn't hear a splash. Others could be included here, but these were just the ones that came off the top of my head. Again, of course, with these other disappearances, the circumstances vary wildly, and they're not necessarily a one-to-one with Nicola's in terms of the circumstances or anything like that. But this is only to say that the UK has had its fair share of weird or unusual disappearances that have in fact not been fully explained. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and do drop me a comment as I read pretty much all of them. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.